It's a great honor for me to be here at the Empire Club of Canada today, which is arguably the most famous and historically relevant speakers podium to have ever existed in Canada. It has offered its podium to such international luminaries as Winston Churchill, Ronald Reagan, Audrey Hepburn, the Dalai Lama, Indira Gandhi, and closer to home, from Pierre Trudeau to Justin Trudeau. Literally generations of our great nation's leaders, alongside with those of the world's top international diplomats, heads of state, and business and thought leaders.
It is a real honor and a distinct privilege to be invited to speak to the Empire Club of Canada, which has been welcoming international diplomats, leaders in business and in science and in politics. And when they stand at that podium, they speak not only to the entire country, but they can speak to the entire world.
Good afternoon, fellow directors, past presidents, members, and guests. Welcome to the 117th season of the Empire Club of Canada. My name is Antoinette Tumilo. After tomorrow, I become the immediate past president of the board of directors of the Empire Club of Canada. What a privilege to be your host for today's virtual event, Building Better in 2021. I'd like to begin this afternoon with an acknowledgement that we are hosted on the land of the Mississaugas of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat. We also recognize the enduring presence of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. We encourage everyone tuning in today to learn more about the traditional territory on which you work or live. I now want to take a moment to recognize our sponsors who generously support the Empire Club and make these events possible. Thank you to our very generous co-lead sponsors, CN and Waste Connections Canada, who is also a seasoned sponsor, and our supporting sponsors, TELUS, Trinity College International Relations Program at the University of Toronto, and Tres Capital, and our other seasoned sponsor, the Canadian Bankers Association. Last but not least, I also want to thank our event partner, BBC and livemeeting.ca, for webcasting today's event. Now, I just want to remind everyone participating today that this is an interactive event. Although a recording of this event will be made available, those attending live are encouraged to engage with our speakers by taking advantage of the question box to the right of your screen. We have allotted some time for Q&A towards the end of the discussion. We also invite you to share your thoughts on social media using our hashtags, which you can find in the corner of your viewer throughout the event. To those watching on demand at a later date and to those tuning in on the podcast, welcome and thanks for participating. It is now my pleasure to call this virtual meeting to order. We are very excited to bring you today's event with a very distinguished panel of guest speakers. We are going to discuss how our past response to catastrophic crisis has helped us respond to current challenges, and then we will look ahead to how we can do better. Have we learned from our past responses? Is history repeating itself? Do we need history to guide us to a better future? These questions are important to ask and will be part of today's conversation. I will now briefly introduce our distinguished panelists before turning it over to them to get the discussion started. It's my absolute pleasure to once again welcome the Honorable Jean-Augustine and National Chief Perry Bellegarde. Your continued support of the Empire Club is much appreciated. I would also like to welcome Margaret McMillan to our virtual stage for the first time. Jean-Augustine made history as the first Black woman elected to Canada's Parliament and is the former Cabinet Minister of Multiculturalism and Status of Women. Her tenure included distinguished service as Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister, Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and Deputy Speaker of Parliament. Perry Bellegarde was elected National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations in 2014 and re-elected in 2018. He holds a wealth of leadership experience, having spent the past 3 decades putting into practice his strong beliefs in the laws and traditions instilled in him by the many chiefs and elders he has known over the years. At the community, national, and international levels, Chief Bellegarde is recognized for sound fiscal management and skillfully navigating highly complex policy, political, and legal matters to achieve meaningful change while strengthening relationships along the way. We are honored he agreed to join us today at today's event, which takes place during Indigenous History Month and is one of his last official appearances before the end of his term. Joining Jean and Chief Bellegarde is Margaret McMillan, Professor of History at the University of Toronto and an Emeritus Professor of International History at Oxford University. She was Provost of Trinity College, Toronto from 2002 to 2007 and Warden of St. Anthony's College, Oxford from 2007 to 2017. She is currently a trustee of the Central European University and the Imperial War Museum. Her research specializes in British imperial history and the international history of the 19th and 20th centuries. If you'd like to learn more about any of our panelists today, you can find their full bios by scrolling down below the video window on your screen. Now, I'd like to turn it over to the Honorable Jean Augustine to get the discussion started. Over to you, Jean.
And thank you so much for the introduction and also the honor of meeting the two panelists that you've brought forward today. The Empire Club's theme for this session is Building Better in 2021. I know that this is a very important week and a very important month, and very important events have caused us to be joyous, to be sorrowful, to be reflective, and to respond to the world around us. So as we begin to look forward to the summer, to the months when we as Canadians see the sun and enjoy the joys of being outdoors, coming out of the pandemic, the two words build better seem to reflect the way that we feel. We know that various and varying incidents have created for us through the pandemic opportunities to address the many inequalities. The pandemic has intensified the tragedies that we have experienced through the residential school victims, conversations around racism, inequalities, injustices. All these things are more or less, as they would say, bubbling as we reach and we go forward to this and into the summer. But we are inspired, and our two panelists are going to help us to reflect on the past, look at the present situation, and more or less help us to meet that theme of building better in 2021. It is important that we have a historian who can talk about economic recessions, foreign conflicts. We have the national chief who can speak about things like reconciliation, the lot of our Indigenous peoples, etc., the strengths we have in Canada, and how we can bring this all together, and how all of this can lead us to building a better, a fairer, a more inclusive community, and not only here in Canada, but also a community abroad. And so in starting and in reflecting on your words, Antonella, it reminds me of something in African culture called the Sankofa. The Sankofa's image is that of a bird with a very, very long neck. And that bird stands with the neck reaching backwards, and then finding whatever there is in the back, and the analogy is looking to the past, bringing it forward to the present, reflecting it in the present, and then the net goes out as it moves to the future, moves itself forward. So it's the past, it's the present, which is a reflection of the past, and the way to move forward. And so Sankofa, and the image of the Sankofa comes to mind as I think about where we are today, where we were, what we've learned, and how we can move forward to build better, as your theme says, in 2021. And so let me begin then with the first question to the panel. What has most impressed you about the way that Canadians and people in other countries have come together during this COVID crisis? In what ways have they created a stronger community than there was before? Do we feel stronger than there was before the pandemic? Where have we gone wrong in the handling of the pandemic? And what past wrongs are there in our society that we could look at and learn from as we move forward? This has a whole historical base to the question. And so I'd like to start with you, Margaret, since you are the historian in our midst.
Very much. It is a great honor to be here. I think the National Chief is something of an historian as well, so I want to hear what he has to say about it. But I think your image of the bird looking back and then moving to the future is a very good one and a very powerful one, because I think we're all products of our history, and our societies and our institutions are products of the past. And so I think we need to understand that if we're to understand ourselves and our institutions. I think the past can also help us think about the present. It doesn't teach us necessarily very clear lessons, but what it can do is give us examples, and it can give us ways of thinking about how we might deal with our present situation. And I think human history, sadly, has been marked by a lot of crises, some that go on for years and years and years, as the residential schools did, but some that come suddenly, a sudden famine, a sudden economic crash, a sudden war breaks out, a pandemic. And history is made up of these challenges, some that unroll over many years and some that come suddenly. And I think what we can learn from looking at the past is how societies can pull together and deal with some of these crises. And we can learn. I mean, I think that is something we have to remember. We can learn from the past. It's not something that is just a mystery that we can't understand. And I think we can use it to think about the present, think about what we're doing, to ask the sort of questions we need. Because if we don't ask good questions, we don't have a hope of finding good answers. And I think what past catastrophes show that sometimes societies can deal with them, that human beings can be extraordinarily resilient. You know, you think of what people went through when they were being bombed, for example, in London in the Second World War, how they survived it, how they even made jokes about it, how life somehow went on. And societies can also, I think, and I think we're doing this at the moment, take a very good look at themselves in a crisis. Sometimes a real crisis, a real, you weren't quite right, you weren't doing that well. I think we've known about growing inequalities in many Western societies. We've known that we haven't been keeping up with some of the things we should be keeping up with. And so I think we've learnt from that. I think we've seen where we're going wrong. I think we have the possibility of fixing things, which is very important. And people have done it in the past. You know, real advances were made in the past, for example, during both world wars, to the position of women, to the position of the working classes. What the welfare state was brought in Britain at the end of the Second World War, because the government and those in charge understood that things had to be done differently. So I think we are reevaluating ourselves, and I think this can be good, and I think this can be positive. And so I'd like to think that out of this time, as out of the other difficult times, something good will come.
Chief, Margaret has set us down the road where she's talking about what good will come, what we've learned through the World War, and of course, looking at the welfare state and what has come out as a result of the struggles, as a result of the recognition of the lot of individuals. But I know, Chief, we are in the present, and it is a painful period for us as Canadians in this present. So in this COVID, post-COVID, we can't talk about post-COVID just yet, but in this COVID crisis, have we created a stronger community in the recognition of the past wrongs in Canadian society? Have we, or are we creating a better society and a better community as we build forward?
Well, ni stamina pixke ni hea na psisi. Ni naskomon. Ke naskom tinoal kakia no temptik no akomaganak. Jean, Margaret can naskomtin no chagan. Empire Club can naskomtin oal. Cuz keteo Moscos is gonna go no tinia, Treaty 4 territory. Just a little bit in Cree, I'm saying, my friends, my relatives, I'm happy to be with you all. Acknowledging Jean and Margaret as panelists, and thank you for your work, and acknowledging as well the Empire Club and Antoinette for the good work. I said I'm from Little Black Bear Reserve, Kuskateo Musko Sisters, Skunaginutsinia, Treaty 4 territory in southern Saskatchewan. And with all this COVID-19 that hit all of our people, and like everybody in Canada, lots of people have lost loved ones, you know, and our hearts and prayers go out to the families, communities that have lost loved ones. And for us as First Nations people here in Canada, we have 634 First Nations across Canada. Over, 60 plus Indigenous nations, if you will, by our languages. We have 60 different languages. And Mohawk, Mi'kmaq, Cree, Dene. We have communities that are isolated in the north. And so with COVID-19 pandemic that hit us, it hit the First Nation communities pretty hard. But I'm also happy that it was dealt with in a very effective and efficient way. It could have been worse because we have overcrowded housing conditions. We don't have access to potable water. So the things like social distancing, washing your hands was very difficult for a lot of First Nations communities, the isolation as well. So having access to proper PPE, having access to good quality healthcare has always been a challenging, and a lot of First Nations peoples have done really well in that front. And building a good relationship with the appropriate government departments to make sure that there is proper PPE and resources, both human and financial, to meet those healthcare crises. I think like past, present, future is a really good analogy, and I want to thank you for your analogy of Sankofa. We learn from the past. We don't need to live there. And charting a fast forward future together is very important to build a better country for all of our peoples. Is very important because I always talk about closing the gap, and that's needed to close the gap in education and housing and water and infrastructure and proper health care. The numbers I used at some times were, according to the United Nations Human Development Index, Canada was rated 6th quality of life, but you apply the same indices to First Nations people, we're 63rd. And that's where we need to close the gap going forward together. And we need all Canadians to work with us and embrace that idea of maintaining momentum to close the gap. COVID-19 is something that has brought people together, to work together so that there is a limited or a real small impact on the families, communities, and villages and tribes and nations, if you will, of Canada with this COVID-19 pandemic going forward. There's people scared of vaccines. There was people were still denying the science, but I think there's an embracing of that now, and that's providing some hope and inspiration going forward.
Mm-hmm. Margaret,
I was just
like a comment? Yes.
I want to add how much I agree with that. And that what this crisis has shown, I think, is that we can work together and that we can at different levels of government as well. I mean, I think there's been a very important recognition that we need government. You know, there's been too much criticism of government as not necessary. And I think what's been shown is that if you have good government, you can deal with some of these problems on a local scale, but also on a nationwide scale. And so I think the chief is right. I think we need to take from this, certainly the lessons where things went wrong, but also our capacity to work together, which is there and I think can be built upon.
Very well said. At the same time, you know, I'm still curious to know how we can use history as a way to forecast the future. Because it seems to me that in our situation, especially around the First Nations, etc., I'm not too sure how much we learned from history that we brought into the present to make the future better. So can you talk about how we can make the learnings of the past relevant so that the future can be better as a result of the learnings? Chief?
Jean, thank you for that question, because in Canada, we have the residential schools. You know, I've said before, there are two things that really hurt First Nations people in this country called Canada. One was the residential schools. Number two was the Indian Act. So between the residential schools and the Indian Act, it was colonization and oppression. And we still see and feel the intergenerational trauma of those two things. The residential schools, we see this is hot, this is fresh, not only in Canada, but throughout the world. The world is watching Canada with the 215 children in a mass grave, with the 751 unmarked graves at Cowessus. Well, there were 139 residential school sites in Canada. So there will be more grave discovery, you know, the harsh reality. I've called the residential schools a genocide of our people, because even according to the UN definition of genocide, forceful removal of children from their families, inflicting harm and pain. It meets the definition and criteria, no question. And so for those listeners that are listening, don't know anything about residential schools, it was when little children were taken from their homes and their families, their communities, and institutionalized. And everything good about being a First Nations person was taught and ingrained in them that it's no good. Your beautiful long hair was cut. Your languages are no good. Your ceremonies are no good. You're cut off from your families. And then you're imposed in this institution where there was no proper health care. There's overcrowded conditions with tuberculosis and smallpox, malnutrition. And then you impose on top of that sexual abuse and physical abuse and mental abuse. The word survivors is a very fitting term for our people that have survived those institutions. They survived a genocide. We feel the intergenerational trauma, and that's reflected in the 40,000 First Nations children in foster care, the disproportionate number of First Nations men and women in jails, the high youth suicide rate amongst our people, 5 to 7 times the national average. That's the residential schools. The second one, the imposition of the Indian Act in 1876. It controlled us, the permit system. We couldn't leave the reserves without a permit till 1951. No access to a lawyer till 1951. It was illegal to get legal advice right up until 1951. And then as well, not allowed to vote till 1961 in federal provincial elections. So the list will go on and on. But the Indian Act, basically the land and resources were exploited. And so First Nations weren't part of that system in terms of developing this beautiful country. And so that's the two things that have hurt First Nations people, Indigenous peoples in Canada. So even the debate coming up on Canada Day, people say it's a time for reflection. It's a time to think about the truth and the history. And I would say that it's really important what happens after Canada Day. How do we continue to work together to build a bright future for all the people, the 38 million people here in this beautiful country called Canada? We learn from the past, but working together to chart a future that's bright where all people can benefit from the land and resource wealth. All people can be respected for the diversity of their languages and their culture and their ceremonies and their traditions. All those things are important. And this theme of building better is a huge opportunity for us to do that, because we think we're scared of this pandemic. and the impacts it has. But you know, there's a bigger challenge that we all have to get our head around, and that's climate change, climate catastrophe. That's the big one. We'll get through COVID-19. We have to make sure that there is something left in terms of clean air, clean land, clean water for our children and our grandchildren and those generations yet unborn. That's where we got to start putting our focus and energy. And I've said this before, that the best chapter or the story about Canada has yet to be written. And it's going to be your children and your grandchildren with my children and our grandchildren writing it together. And that's where there's hope and inspiration for a bright future for all of us. That's what I think.
Well, I think I agree with you, Chief, because in order to go forward, to build better, we must really be aware of the past. We have to know that history. And if we don't know that history, in a land of immigrants and people who are joining us in this land, not knowing the history, building back better will not occur in the way in which we would like to see the future. But Margaret, I want to ask you, what do you think is one of the most important things that those living in Canada must do now to build a better Canada and a better world?
I think we're doing some of it. And I think what we're doing, and I think the Chief has talked about it, we are understanding our history better. And we are opening, it's like cleaning out a wound. I mean, there was such injustice done in the residential schools, and it's a very long and a very sad story. And not enough of us knew about it. And I think that knowledge is now out there. And I think there's a very important psychological moment when you know that something was not right in the past and you acknowledge it. And I think Canadian society has been going through a very often difficult process of acknowledging. And we prided ourselves on being one of the nicest countries in the world. And we're having now to recognize that in some ways we're not. And I think that in a way is a type of maturity. We're coming to terms with our past, and it's a complicated past. And other countries have done this as well. I mean, there is, I think, a natural human tendency to turn away from things that are unpleasant or to try and conceal them. Yes. I think in Yugoslavia, for example, there wasn't an acknowledgement of what had happened during the Second World War when Yugoslavs had fought each other and there had been mass murders. It was suppressed. And for a while, I think the Germans didn't want to recognize their history after the Second World War ended. And eventually they did. And I think it made, in the case of Yugoslavia, it destroyed the country because they never recognized it. In the case of Germany, they did recognize the horrors that had been committed by Germany in the course of the Second World War. And so I think once you have brought these things out into the open, there's no going back. And I think that's important. But I think the other thing, looking to the future, is, and I think, again, the Chief has said it, and the title of this session, it's building better, and it's a process. We should never think we're going to get there, because it's a constant process. It's like a house. You have to keep repairing it. You have to keep fixing it. You have to keep working on it. But I'm hoping that there is a will in Canada to do this, that, it seems to me that the general reaction among the Canadian public to learning about this complex and often dark history of Canada has been a very healthy one. There's been a desire to how can we do better? And I think very important that we should continue to want to work together. And again, as the Chief has said, I have to keep agreeing with him. I'm afraid we're not going to have one of those discussions where we disagree with each other. But I think climate change is, it is an existential challenge. It's a challenge for the future of the human race. And we have got to continue to find ways to work together. And these have got to be, of course, within countries, but they've also got to be international. And I think, we can never sit back. I think perhaps there's a Canadian tendency, I share it myself, to say, well, we've done pretty well. We can sit back and relax and enjoy it. We can't. It's a process. You have to keep working at it. But you should never give up hope, because we have seen that things can change. And again, I think the pandemic, this extraordinary effort to get vaccines has shown what we can do when we set our minds to it. Mm-hmm. And governments that were saying, 2 years ago, no, we can't spend money on this. We can't spend money on helping people who are out of work. We can't afford it. Have suddenly stopped saying that. And they've spent money hand over fist to do the things that need to be done. And so I think we can do these things when we are faced with a challenge. And we have to keep remembering that we need to keep working at it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And may I ask you then, Chief, how can we create stronger, lasting bonds? Because we know as human beings, we do the things like never again, lest we forget. And then we repeat the history, and we repeat some things that we would like to see eradicated from our societies. So I can ask, how can we create stronger, lasting bonds to create a permanent foundation that allows us to build this better Canada?
Well, thank you for that, Jean. I always say education and awareness leads to understanding, leads to action. So education and awareness, there's been 5 great reports in Canada, right from the Hawthorne report to the Penner report to the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples report. Now we have the 94 calls to action and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report, then the 200 plus calls to justice and the Missing Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report. Implementation. We don't need another report or study anymore. We need to implement all of those calls to action and recommendations. And that's what we need to get our heads around as people. And to embrace as well, the curriculums have to change in every province and territory in Canada. To teach from kindergarten to grade 12 about the residential schools. To teach about the Indian Act. To teach treaties, treaty relationship. We know the Treaty of Ghent and the Treaty of Paris. Do people know about the Victorian treaties? Or the Treaty of Niagara? Or the Two-World Wampum Treaty? These should be taught because those treaties are very important. It's about peaceful coexistence and mutual respect. And there was a sacred covenant made between our peoples and Creator God asked to witness this. So that's one way. Education awareness in the schools, get familiarized with those 5 reports, but implementation of the recommendations on the MMIW and the TRC calls to action, all the 94 calls to action. There's a map there. We even talk about the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's a roadmap to reconciliation. And now we have Bill C-15 that's been passed. But there's a roadmap to the top of that mountain. But we all have to do the climbing. We all have to work together. And so to make sure we embrace that spirit of reconciliation. And there has to be truth telling. And that's before you can get to reconciliation. And I think we have to keep working together to build that country collectively. And I was talking earlier on about the Sundance Lodge to Jean and Margaret and how we embrace our worldview as First Nations people, and we're the 2-legged tribe. I was explaining, but we acknowledge, and we don't care if you're black, yellow, red, white. We're the 2-legged. We're human beings. But we acknowledge our relatives, the 4-leggeds, the flyers, the swimmers, the crawlers, Mother Earth, Father Sky, Grandmother Moon, Grandfather Sun. We're all part of that global family. The one that sits in the east, south, west, north. Male plants, female plants. And the 4 grandmothers that look after the water, rainwater, fresh water, salt water. And when life comes, water breaks. We're part of that. And I think if we embrace that worldview, we'll not only have a better country, we'll have a better world. That's what I think.
Well, thank you for that, Chief. Margaret, I grew up in Happy Hill, St. George's, Grenada. Schooled in the colonial setting and knew all about treaties and knew all about the wars that were fought in different places. And there was an expression, we live in a global village. Mm-hmm. And as a youngster in school, that global village, and even as an adult here in Canada, the issue of global village came home very, very strongly to me as we dealt with the pandemic. Mm. So we are in a global village. What affects one affects all, is the old adage. How do you see all of this question, those brought up by the chiefs, those brought up as a result of the gaps that we saw as a result of the pandemic, the gaps between the haves and the have-nots, the discussion around diversity and inclusiveness? How do you see all of this in a global sense?
I think at the moment we have a very turbulent world. Canada for all its problems, is in some ways an oasis of calm in a world that is different. And it is complicated. I think we need to build our own societies. But as you say, we are part of a global world, and the pandemic has made us very aware of that. Viruses do not stop at borders. And as long as there's a virus, as long as the COVID-19 and its variants are somewhere in the world, we're all going to be worried about it. It affects us all, and there's no way that we can protect ourselves against it forever, or the other pandemics which are probably going to come. And so I think we need both to be citizens of our own societies and do what we can to strengthen them, because then we can be more effective in dealing globally. You know, a strong society can contribute more to a global order. And I think at the moment, again, if I can just refer back to history, we are in a time of transition in the world, a time that reminds me a bit of the period before the First World War, when Britain, the British Empire, for all that it looked very strong, was beginning to feel the weight of that power. Power can be very expensive. It was, I think, it overstretched itself beyond its resources. It was facing competitors in the United States, Germany, and Japan. And it made for a turbulent time. When the power feels that it is declining in power, it may lash out. Rising powers may want to get their space in the world. And I think at the moment we're in a world in which the United States, I think, is considering its position in the world. It has been the superpower, the hegemonic power, but it is feeling the strain. And of course, it's a divided society at home, I think. And the last election showed, I think, just how divided it is. And you have a China which is pushing for more of a place in the world, which is in many ways behaving in an increasing aggressive and belligerent form. And we have the problems that we all have to deal with, climate change, the great one that is looming over us all. And so I think it's a difficult world that we live in. And I think we have to recognize that we are both citizens of our own societies, our own countries, our own nations, but we are also dealing with an international order which has become weaker. And many of the institutions we set up after 1945, you know, when we have a great catastrophe, we learn quickly and we set up institutions to try and prevent it. And then time goes by and we forget why we wanted them. And we forget why we wanted a United Nations. We forget why we wanted a World Health Organization. We forget why we wanted a World Bank or an International Monetary Fund. And we need to remember that those institutions came out of a crisis, have helped to keep the world stable. Not always. We know it's a difficult and complex world, but we need to continue to reinforce international cooperation. And Canada has always played a great part in that. I mean, I think we've always been a country that has recognized obligations to the rest of the world. We haven't always done it well. We haven't always recognized obligations to our own people at home. But I think there is a willingness in Canada and among Canadians to play this sort of part. And I think that should be encouraged. And I also think education is enormously important. I mean, you know, we are all products of our education. You, like me, probably learnt more British history than you did the history of the Caribbean than I did the history of Canada. And I think very important that school children learn the history of their own country, for better or worse, but they also need to learn where to situate that country in the world. And so education is hugely important, and public discussion, public debate, such as the Empire Club puts on. You know, we need, education isn't something that stops when you graduate from primary school, high school, university. Education is something that should go on through life, and we need informed publics who understand and are able to think. We all need to think about these issues. You know, no one has a monopoly on thinking about them. We all have to think about them.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have a question from Michael, and he asked if we are looking to build back better. We have examples of historical strengths to get through and closing the gap, as Perry Belgrave mentioned. Is there added accountability in technology based on their massive amount of impact that they're having in Canada and in Canada's culture in general? Can they help elevate the lessons of the past to be strong for the future? So he's brought in two words here that we have not really discussed: accountability and technology. So who would like to start on this?
I'll make a quick comment. I think accountability and technology, of course. I know, for example, there's always been the need to be accountable for the investments accountable to make sure they have huge impacts, because again, I talked about closing the gap, and this is the most amount of investments to close the gap, because we had a 2% funding cap for 20 plus years in First Nations country. And now that's been lifted. It's over, we've influenced the last 7 fiscal years. I think it's 40 billion plus in investments in education, water, and housing and infrastructure. And we want to make sure that that's having an impact at the community level. So there's some accountability back. And then as well, the accountability for the land and resources First Nations peoples are sharing with the provinces, with the feds, with all the people in the forestry sector, the mining sector. You know, a lot of the First Nations people are starting to look at equity ownership, but getting involved because we have the accountability of balancing the economy and the environment and making sure that there is a balance and accountability there, sustainable economic development going forward. So getting First Nations people involved and rights and title holders involved makes good economic sense. So accountability is key. Technology, of course, you know, infrastructure, broadband to all of our 634 communities is key, but all communities across Canada should have access to high-speed internet. It just the way you get connected to the world, whether you talk about teleeducation or telehealth, it's important to have access to that broadband piece. And those are my thoughts on technology and accountability.
Mm-hmm. Any comment, Margaret?
I will agree. I think, you know, and that's, I think, why democratic institutions are so important. And we've seen, and we can see today, societies around the world where there's no accountability. I mean, nobody really holds President Putin accountable. Nobody really holds President Xi Jinping accountable. Danger decisions which may not be good ones, and there is no way of throwing a light on those decisions or challenging them. Mm-hmm. Encouraging people to participate in democracy, I think, is enormously important. And I worry sometimes that there is sort of easy cynicism. You get people saying, oh, well, democracy is hopeless, it's inefficient. Well, as Winston Churchill once said, it's, you know, yes, it is inefficient, but it's less bad than any of the others. I'm not quoting him correctly. But I think technology, of course, is, as always, I think, through history, technology can be a great boon and a great curse. And we know that. You know, you think of flight, for example, getting up into the air. It was wonderful. It liberated people. It made us travel around the world quicker. It also brought the bomber, and it brought the capacity to inflict great destruction on other people. And I think the internet is very much the same. It can be enormously liberating. It can give people in parts of the world access to things they might not have had otherwise. I mean, I've done Zoom talks where people from around the world have been on, and that wasn't possible before. I mean, I think that's enormously important. But the danger, of course, that is out there in the internet is the echo chambers where people only go to sites that echo what they want to hear. They get confirmed in their views. And the conspiracy theories that travel around, you know, the mad sort of theories that travel around the internet, which can be so dangerous and so destructive, and the very damaging ways that social media can be used. And it can be used for good, as we know, but then you get the, you know, increasing misuse of social media to attack people, hound people, you know, spread lies about them. I mean, the cruelty that can be inflicted. So technology is itself is neutral, but it can be used for good or bad. And I think we need to think collectively about how we use it for good and how we regulate it and how we prevent some of the more negative sides.
Okay, we have another question, and this one comes from Barb. And she says, there seemed to be a greater focus on my rights at the expense of our responsibilities, compared to in my parents' time, and this is at a time that schools, to their credit, seem to be focusing curriculum on social good. What do Perry and Margaret suggest to help redirect the focus to broader social good than my rights?
I'll take a stab at that, if I may. I mean, I think these things swing back and forth. And I think we've seen a lot of the language of rights, which is important because there are rights that we need to acknowledge and deal with if they're not being respected. But I agree that we also need to think about responsibility. And I find that the language of rights can be used too loosely. People say, well, it's my right not to have a vaccine. It's my right to do whatever I want. Well, it's not. If you're hurting the rest of society, there's a limitation on what your right will do and can't do. And so I do think we need to think also of responsibility. And when we do things, they should not be trampling on the rights of others. And again, I think is negotiation. I might have a right to do something that might conflict with someone else's right, and then we have to sit down and talk about it. You know, I think there are certainly fundamental rights about the rights of people to life, to opportunities to try and express themselves, to try and use their talents. But I don't like the language of being rights simply as a defense for people saying, I'll do whatever I want, I have a right to do it. And that's where I think responsibility is very important. And I think, you know, we swing back and forth in human society, but I think, again, the COVID pandemic has made us more aware of our responsibility to others. Even the act of wearing a mask, you're showing responsibility to others.
Well, thank you. And I'll go to the next question because I'm trying to meet the needs and the rights of every person engaged with us today. And Scott asks, what is the single most important action that could provide for clean, potable, drinkable water for all Indigenous peoples? The single most important action, Chief.
Adequate investment in infrastructure. That's the single most important thing. Ensuring that there's capacity at the community level as well for water treatment plant operators, but ensuring there's adequate human and financial resources in the communities for access to potable drinking water. It's a fundamental human right. You know, we have over 57 boil water advisories still in Canada, and some have been Nishkanaga, 25 years. no drinking water, 25 years. In Canada, that's not acceptable. So the single most thing, this is a very good question, ensuring that there's human and financial resources in place and capacity at the community level to ensure that there is potable water for peoples in those communities. That's it.
And I agree with Scott. This has always been my question. I don't want to personalize this, but this has always been my question. Mm-hmm. Why is it in Canada we cannot, over 25 years, find a way to provide, you know, that drinkable, potable water for communities?
Yeah, that's the response. Indian Affairs, it used to be Indian Affairs, now it's Indigenous Services Canada. You have to make sure the bureaucracy that's there in place is effective and efficient, and ensuring that there's adequate resources and investment, but capacity building as well at the community level. And the community, the chiefs and councils know their needs. Once they're identified, that should be met. And so, again, just to reiterate what I said earlier.
Yes. And Mehdi asks us, with recent event happening with several ethnic minorities, how can Canada move forward to create a more equal society for all?
Well, I'm not sure which particular ethnic minorities you're referring to, but in any society, though, we know that there are injustices, and those injustices are often inflicted on those who are minorities in some way because they seem other or they seem different. And again, I think it really is what we've been talking about with how does Canada come to terms with its Indigenous history? How does Canada come to terms with the ways in which Canadian society, the majority of Canadian society, has not recognized, has not understood, has not dealt with these Indigenous issues? And I think it's the same with any minority. But, you know, the whole notion of an ethnic minority, I think, is something that certainly in Canada is something that is fluid, because you have a fairly high rate, and I think increasing rate of intermarriage. And you have communities which are themselves beginning to merge with other communities. And this doesn't mean they lose their own culture. It doesn't mean they lose their own particular take on the world. But I do think we learn from each other. And when I think the way in which the Toronto of my childhood has changed, and how the city looks now compared to how it looked when I was young, and the ways in which just at the level of the food we eat, you know, the ways in which our cultures have been learning from each other and reflecting each other and melding with each other, I think is very healthy. But where there is an injustice, and that is what we must deal with. I mean, that is what any society worth the name of society must deal with. But sometimes it takes us a while to recognize it. Sometimes it takes us, you know, much too long.
Just quickly on that one, Jean, just very quickly. Ethnic minorities, as we're First Nations people, we're Indigenous peoples. So we always say there's a difference between Indigenous peoples and ethnic minorities. We, as Indigenous peoples, we have our own languages, our own lands, our own laws, our own people, identifiable forms of government. 5 elements for the inherent right to self-determination to be recognized. Very different from ethnic minorities. We might be 5% of Canada's population, but we're Indigenous peoples. And so there's a difference. But because of that, we can still say and feel that there is racism and discrimination amongst people of color. We think of Black Lives Movement. We think of the overly policing, against Black people, against First Nations people. We think of the racism and discrimination in the healthcare system. Joyce Echequan. The list will go on and on and on. And so we need to deal with that. There should be a national strategy to deal with and end with racism and discrimination for all peoples, so that there is a broader and just society in Canada. That's how we need to move together. And we're people. And there should be respect for that diversity, no question. And I just wanted to make that comment. There is a difference, but we still feel that sting of racism and discrimination all the time. We just need to find a way and have a collective strategy, not only in Canada, but globally, to deal with ending racism and discrimination so that all peoples can be respected. And we're stronger through the respect for our diversity here in this country.
And Mina has a question for us, but I think we've answered it, and Chief, you've answered it. In your last comment. She asks, what are the most important lessons that new immigrants must learn about Canada when they choose to make it their home? And I think you just spoke to that.
Bill C-5 just been passed as well, and Bill C-8. Bill C-8 is the citizenship or oath of office in Canada. So when all the immigrants come in, they'll officially be sworn in as Canadians, right?
Yeah.
Well, there's also reference to respect in recognizing treaty rights. Like you can say we're all treaty people in Canada because we're all to benefit from sharing the land and resources. And so we're all treaty people. And so there's reference to that now in Canada's guide, but as well just to learn the real history, and to know that there is a history that in a lot of times is not always good. But you learn from the past, you don't need to live there. And how do you chart a brand new future full of bright light for all the people coming to this country? Yes. Again, with peaceful coexistence and mutual respect. That's what the treaty relationship with the Crown is about. And that we have to hang on to that.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you to those who went into the chat room and sent us the questions. They were very thought-provoking. There was one who commented, but was pulled back, saying, can historians talk about the future? Because when we look at the word history, we think about the collection of things of the past. And so let's end then with a little bit of a closing remark, Margaret, for about a minute or so, and then Chief, I'll give you a minute. But if you can just take that provocative kind of question. Can a historian really look to the future?
Well, we do look to the future and we usually get it wrong. So we probably shouldn't. We've been notoriously unsuccessful in predicting what the future is going to be. But what we can do, and I say this modestly, but I think what we can do is recognize patterns. And we can ask the questions, what if we do such and such? What might happen? Because there are examples from the past. So if we don't deal with problems, what might happen? We know what might happen, So I think, don't ask me to predict what's going to happen tomorrow, please. But, because I'll get it wrong.
Okay, Chief?
As I said before, Jean, is that the best story of Canada is yet to be written. And it's your children and my children and our grandchildren that will write it together, and those yet to come. And we're, as community, we have to be compassionate for each other. We have to be caring for each other and lift each other up in good times and in bad times. And we really need to create a future that is full of bright light and hope. And I sincerely believe we can do that if we embrace our worldview, and I've talked about that already. And that's what I believe. We're human beings. We're part of the global human race. And we need to respect that and leave something good, clean air, clean land, clean water for future generations. And if we can make and call Canada the place where each and every one of us has what we want and need to live the good life that our Creator wants for all of us. That's what I believe. And I think we can do that going forward.
Well, this has been an exhilarating session with two excellent panelists, whom I will call experts, and who were able to guide us through and to take the Empire Club's theme of Build Better in 2021, and to send us away from this session not only with more awareness, but also inspired and also hopeful and optimistic about the future as we go forward. So I want to thank you both, and to say what a pleasure it was for me, and what an experience that I will speak to my grandchildren about. I had a grandson who graduated yesterday, and the kind of future that we're building here in Canada with the help of the Empire Club and all those who participate. I want to say thank you, and thank you so much for the chance to be your moderator today. And now I'll pass you back to the President Emeritus, Antoinette.
Thank you very much, Jean and Chief Bellegarde and Margaret, for a great conversation. There's a wealth of knowledge and historical context that is incredibly important to recognize and reflect upon. It's very clear that our ability to build better in the future is dependent on learning from the past. CN has asked me to deliver the closing remarks on their behalf, and I'm very proud to do so. I started my career there and spent 18 years there. Looking back over the years, CN has spoken multiple times at the club in the last 117 years. The railways and the First Nations have a long history together, and in many ways, the history of the railway parallels the history of Canada. CN was very pleased to support this very important conversation and would gladly have been here to deliver the closing remarks, but they have been very caught up in finalizing a merger agreement with the Kansas City Southern. So all hands on deck, that's what they're doing right now, but they did want me to extend our thanks. So I want to thank CN for being such a terrific sponsor. I want to thank Jean for being a terrific moderator. Jean was part of my opening season. So she did the season opener when I stepped in as president, and now she's doing my season closer. So isn't that fabulous? Chief Bellegarde, so great to have you back. I love when you speak Cree. I think it's Cree, right? It just sounds so amazing, the language. I think we all need to learn it and learn some of those words. I tried to pronounce some of your words after your Nation Builder event. I just thought, I love it. Margaret, loved hearing from you as well. And you're very humble and modest, but your words of wisdom were amazing. And I need to read up on your books because you have lots to say that I need to learn about. And I want to thank everybody for joining us today. As I said, today marks my last official event of the season at the Empire Club of Canada, and it's my last event as your official host. We have recently elected a new president of the board, Kelly Jackson, who some of you have already met this past season and will be hosting our upcoming events. It's been an absolute pleasure connecting with you over the past year, all virtually, of course. I'm the first and hopefully the only virtual president of the Empire Club. We had a successful season with 43 events. We had over 25,000 registrants for our events, which we were able to provide admission to free of charge thanks to the generosity of our sponsors. Thank you all for your continued support of the Empire Club. We are offering some events over the summer, so don't miss out. Up next in our calendar is a panel discussion on the future of elder care in Canada on July 8th at 12 noon. Registration is complimentary and is available at empireclubofcanada.com. And following that on July 15th, same time, we are planning an event discussing the economic impact of the Toronto Island Airport and its role in the recovery and reopening of the economy. Registration for that event will open shortly. We hope you can join us for both those events. And again, thanks for joining us today. This meeting is now adjourned.